What if Catherine of Aragon had taken the advice to step aside, leave her position as queen, and retire to a nunnery? Would it have changed the fate of England? Could it have prevented the English Reformation? Would Mary have remained legitimate? Could Anne Boleyn have had a son? And perhaps, most importantly, would England have remained Catholic? Today we're diving into this fascinating what if of Tudor history and considering all the factors that might have changed if Catherine had made a different choice. Thank you so much to Charlie Beth, who asked, should Catherine of Aragon have taken the advice to abdicate her role as queen and join a nunnery? How would her making that alternate choice have altered history? Catherine was pressured multiple times by Henry VIII, Cardinal Campeggio, and even members of the clergy to enter a convent. This was a diplomatic way for Henry to end the marriage without a full scandal. Had she accepted, she would have taken religious vows and been removed from public life, either in England or perhaps Spain. But would it have been that simple? That leads us to our first big question. Would Catherine have been allowed to enter a nunnery peacefully? Even if Catherine had been willing, would the Empire and Spain have allowed it? Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Spain had a vested interest in keeping her as Henry's consort. If she stepped down, it could have been seen as a diplomatic victory for Henry and a loss for Spain, the Empire and the Catholic cause. Would Charles V have retaliated, perhaps through diplomatic pressure or even by considering military intervention? It's possible that Henry might have faced greater external pressure to keep Catherine in place. Catherine's greatest concern was her daughter Mary. If Catherine had gone to a nunnery willingly, would Mary have remained Henry's legitimate daughter? If Henry had managed to get an annulment with Catherine's consent, he might have allowed Mary to keep her status as his legitimate child, as she was conceived in good faith, but he probably wouldn't have considered her his heir. However, Anne Boleyn, once queen, might have pushed for Mary to be removed entirely, as she saw her as a threat to her own children's inheritance. So, while Mary might have been treated better in the short term, her position as Henry's daughter would still have depended on Anne's influence. But would it have prevented the executions of Elizabeth Barton, people like Sir Thomas More, Bishop Fisher, the Carthusian martyrs, and others? Catherine's refusal to step aside fuelled opposition to Henry's marriage to Anne. Figures like I've mentioned, Elizabeth Barton, More and Fisher, resisted Henry's decisions, some based on their loyalty to Catherine, others because of religious conviction. Had Catherine gone quietly, opposition to Henry might have been weaker. Henry may not have felt the need to execute so many dissenters. However, once Henry was determined to be the supreme head of the church in England, anyone who refused to recognise his authority was at risk. So, while fewer people might have died, Henry's repression of dissent was likely inevitable. But here's the big question. If Catherine had stepped aside, would Henry have still broken with Rome? If she'd gone willingly, the Pope might have granted Henry an annulment, allowing him to marry Anne Boleyn without a major conflict with the Catholic Church. However, by the time Henry was seeking an annulment, he was already frustrated with papal authority. Even with the legal annulment, Henry might have pursued greater control over the church, especially if he realised how much wealth and power he could gain by separating from Rome. So while the break might have been delayed, Henry's ambitions suggest that it may have happened eventually, just under different circumstances. Had Catherine entered a nunnery sooner, Henry could have married Anne earlier, perhaps by 1530 instead of 1533. Would this have given Anne a better chance of having a healthy son? Possibly. A younger Anne might have had a stronger reproductive window. Of course, it's possible that Anne still wouldn't have had a son, and Henry would have eventually looked for another wife, as he did in real history. But if Anne had given birth to a son, she would have been safe, and Henry would have remained married to her. So no Queen Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Of course, Anne may still have died in childbirth or from disease, and Henry may still have pursued more marriages, particularly if he was attracted to another woman or if political alliances demanded it. And of course, he would have wanted a spare. If Anne had had a son, then the course of English history would have changed. He would have become king in 1547, and there would have been no Edward VI. That creates all kinds of alternative scenarios. One of the biggest consequences of Henry's break with Rome was the dissolution of the monasteries, which brought immense wealth to the crown. Would he have done this without a full break from Rome? Possibly. Henry was always in need of money, and he might still have seized monastic lands, justifying it by arguing that the monasteries were corrupt or inefficient. So while the timing might have changed, the destruction of England's monasteries was probably still on the horizon. But would the Reformation have happened? Well, without Henry's break from Rome, England might have remained officially Catholic, at least during his reign. However, Protestant ideas were already spreading from the continent, and Anne Boleyn was a keen patron of reform, so had she remained queen, then things would probably have changed gradually. But if Henry had not introduced the Reformation, his son Edward VI might have done so even more aggressively, but it would depend if Edward VI even existed. On the other hand, Mary might have had an easier time restoring Catholicism if England had never fully broken with Rome in the first place. So while the Reformation might have looked different, religious change in England was probably inevitable. Catherine of Aragon's refusal to step aside shaped Tudor England. Her determination forced Henry's hand, led to the break with Rome, and set the stage for everything that followed. If she'd entered a convent, England might have avoided some turmoil in the short term, but Henry's ambition, his need for a son, and his financial interests suggest that major changes were coming either way. But what do you think? Would England have stayed Catholic? Would Anne Boleyn have had a son? And I guess there are factors that I've missed. In fact, I'm sure there are. So do let me know in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this, then please do like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.